Hey there, I'm Alicia, and it's finally time for me to talk about my favorite books of 2022. It's been a long time coming, and I'm really excited to talk about them. I did manage to narrow it down to a list of 10 books, and I do have a couple of honorable mentions that I'll briefly fly through, but with that, let's get into the video. 2022 was an immensely exciting reading year for me, not only because I found so many new great authors, but also because I found some really incredible books in some genres that I tend to not gravitate towards, which is really exciting for me. So with that, I do have 3 honorable mentions to mention. The first one of those is going to be Exhalation by Ted Chiang. This is a collection of science fiction short stories, and it's quite possibly the best short story collection that I've ever read. What I think is really tricky about short story collections is that they have to feel cohesive, but each individual story also has to feel complete and well realized, and I think that that's definitely the case in Exhalation. Every single short story that I read felt complete. He also imbues his stories with commentary on the human condition, humanity, and philosophy, and I just really quite enjoyed this short story collection. I can't wait to read more by Ted Chiang. The next honorable mention on my list is a book that slowly crept up on me, and that is going to be Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel. I ended up reading this right in December as my reading was starting to wind down. It's actually a book that took me over 2 months to read, and that's because it's a book that is very quiet and very slow. And at the time, there were other books that were more fast-paced that caught my attention, but I always kept coming back to Sea of Tranquility because I was still intrigued. And Sea of Tranquility is actually a literary science fiction book. It's made up of several parts, so in some aspects, it also feels like reading a short story collection. Over these separate stories, we follow a variety of different characters, and you don't really get a sense of how they're all connected until you get past the 50% mark of the book. Again, it's a book that just quietly snuck up on me. It's one that I wanted to keep reading, and the way just everything came together at the end, I was just blown away. I would say that if you're someone who likes very linear reads and very fast-paced reads, this is one that may not be up your lane. But if you enjoy a book that has quiet moments in it about humanity, where there's connections but you can't really see them until the very end, then I think this is a great one to pick up. It's definitely one of those books that I can see myself rereading, sitting down with a cup of tea and just having a very slow day. I really enjoyed it. The last honorary mention that I have for you today is called Hola, Papi, How to Come Out in a Walmart Parking Lot and Other Lessons by Paul Brammer. This is a book that I don't own. I did listen to it on audiobook through my library on the Libby app. This was a book that I just picked up on a whim. I had no idea what it was about, but I was having a slow month and I didn't really know what I wanted to read next. So I did borrow this book, and it was one of the best decisions that I've ever made. This is a book that is witty and smart and funny and full of heart. It is told as a series of column essays, but it is also part memoir. In this book, Paul Brammer recounts his life growing up as a biracial queer man while providing solid advice that is equally funny, introspective, and actually extremely helpful. Not once did I feel like he was pandering or trying to push his agenda. You can tell that it was a book that was written from his heart, and I really appreciated learning more about him and his journey. But I think this is also a great book for people who are struggling with their sexuality and coming out and all of those questions that are, not easily answered, and that a lot of times you have to find answers for on your own. And also at large, she talks more about relationships. So I think this is a book that everyone could get something out of. So those were my honorable mentions. I do have 10 books for you today. Starting off with number 10, I have Forbidden City by Vanessa. This is a historical fiction novel that completely surprised me. I used to read a lot of historical fiction in high school and in my early college days, and then I stopped for a very long time. And I think it's because a lot of the historical fiction that was coming out was about World War II stories, and those narratives, although important, felt saturated and they lost their charm on me. So I gravitated away from historical fiction for a while, and there's a book that I'll talk about later on that reignited that love for me, and I ended up picking up more historical fiction in 2022. Forbidden City was one of those that I just really enjoyed. So this is set in mid 1960s China, right before the Cultural Revolution. And it's a time and important historical period in China that I know very little about. It was actually a book that prompted me to want to learn more about that time period in China. And that's something that I always love, when a book makes me want to learn about the real life events going on in a time period. I find that fascinating. So in Forbidden City, we follow a 15-year-old rural girl named May. So in a way, May is recruited and taken away from her family and brought over to this new Forbidden City that is presided by Chairman Mao. Here she becomes part of a dance group, and this is a really coveted position. One of those reasons is because a large part of the country lives in poverty, especially the people living in rural areas where her family is from. The family of the girls who join this group get extra help in order to survive. But another reason is because you get to be around the most powerful man in the country, including Chairman Mao. And so we do follow the life of this 15-year-old girl who is in love with her country, and she is brainwashed and illusioned by the love of her country and that of Chairman Mao. She not only becomes a dancing partner for him, but later on she becomes his mistress and someone that he greatly confides in. And we follow her from when she is this very young, naive girl who is willing to do anything for her country, to learning more about the regime, becoming disillusioned, and just really learning what is actually going on. It was really May's character that was so riveting in this book because it's such a unique lens through which to tell this part of history, and I just found it fascinating. Highly recommend if you really like historical fiction and if you like learning about different time periods and different countries. It's one that I couldn't put down. Book number 9 on this list is Finlay Donovan is Killing It by Elle Cosimano. I started the Finlay Donovan series last year, and I actually already read the newest book that is about to come out. If you don't know what Finlay Donovan is about, we're following this mom who was a writer. In the first book, Finlay's life is seemingly falling apart. She is having writer's block, and she really needs to turn in her next draft to her editor. She has already used all of her advance, and on top of that, she's a single mother who's going through a divorce. And to top it all off, she has been mistaken for a contract killer. So she was in a Pinero pitching the idea for her next book to her editor when someone overhears their conversation and thinks that Finlay is a contract killer. This is definitely one of those books where you have to suspend your disbelief. The Russian mafia gets involved at some point, but it's just one of those books that you just have so much fun and joy reading. At least that was my experience. There's also a little bit of a love triangle going on in this series. One of my favorite things about this series is the relationship between Finlay and her friend Vero. They're just so wacky together and they get each other into a lot of trouble, but it's really nice to see that friendship dynamic, how they're always there for each other no matter what, even when they disagree on things. It was just such a delight to read. So if you're looking for a really fun book where you could just turn off your mind, this is one that I really recommend. The next book on this list is a nonfiction book called Empire of Pain. This is by Patrick Radden Keefe. This is a book that was so well researched and so well written. I'm someone who loves watching documentaries, but I don't always read nonfiction books because they can be a little bit dense and a little bit heavy and hard to get through. That was not the case with Empire of Pain. Patrick does a great job at not only providing really accurate, well-researched information, but also giving you a story that is unputdownable, bingeable, and so consumable. So in Empire of Pain, Patrick Radden talks about the ways in which the Sackler family is responsible in engineering one of the worst public health crises in America, which is the opioid epidemic. We get to learn a lot more about the Sackler family and how they built their empire of pain on promoting addiction. Such a good book. I can't recommend it enough. The next book on this list is called Rebel Sisters. This is by Tochi Onyebuchi, and it's a book that took me by surprise in how much I ended up loving it. It is a mix of science fiction and historical fiction. Because it is the second book in the duology, there's very little I can say without spoiling the first book, so I'll just talk about the duology as a whole. So in War Sisters, we start in the year 2172 after climate change and natural disasters have made the Earth uninhabitable. There are a handful of lucky, privileged individuals who ended up going to live to the space colonies, and everybody left on Earth is left to live in this inhospitable environment. And the story of War Girls is actually based on the Nigerian Civil War that happened between the 1960s and the 1970s. War Girls is a story of a bond between sisters that is tested by the ravages of war, and it's also a nuanced exploration in what it means to be human. We have children soldiers that are being outfitted with bionic limbs in order to fight in the Civil War, and the sisters accidentally end up on either side of this conflict. Now, without giving too much away, Rebel Sisters actually ends up taking place 5 years after this war, and what I really enjoyed about Rebel Sisters in particular is that Tochi Onyebuchi really explores the consequences of war. What does healing look like after war? What is the legacy you're leaving behind? And how do you move forward and put all that pain behind when you were battling your cousins, your brothers, your neighbors? It was just done so well, and I love that he explores these dimensions both in the individual level but also at a societal level. It's by no means an easy book to read during certain parts of it because it is about war, but it's one that is so worth reading. At number 6, we have a memoir. This is called Somebody's Daughter by Ashley Ford. So this was another book that I picked up on a whim. It's not a book that I owned. It's not one that I had on my TBR. I was just going through my library system. I noticed that Somebody's Daughter was available and I picked it up. And here it is on my top 10 books of the year. I actually highly recommend that you pick up the audiobook because it is narrated by Ashley Ford, and the emotion that she just puts into her narration is fantastic. So Ashley's memoir opens up when she gets a call from her mother telling her that her dad is being released from prison, and she uses this specific moment as a catalyst to send us back to her childhood. In the majority of the book, she recounts growing up without her dad and also the very difficult and nuanced relationship that she has with her mother. What I really loved about this book is the storytelling element. Ashley Ford is just an incredible storyteller. There were moments in this book where I just sort of held my breath for what was coming. She just has the capacity to write emotions and to write events about her life that makes you connect with them and makes you reflect on your own life. Really, really enjoyed it. One of the best memoirs I have ever read. Whew. Okay, so we are down to the top 5. I actually do own 4 of the books in my top 5, and once I talk about the one book that I don't own, you'll see why I don't own it. But anyways, coming in at number 5 is Breast and Eggs by Mieko Kawakami, translated by Sam Bennett and David Boyd. This is a book that I read really early on in the year, like January and February, and I think at the time I said that this was going to be my favorite book of the year, and it's still in my top 10, but I just can't imagine that I found books that topped Breast and Eggs because I adored this book when I started reading it. What's so interesting about Breast and Eggs is that it was actually originally published as a novella back in 2008. Mieko Kawakami ended up expanding this book into this current form, which is divided into 2 separate parts. And that's really important for me to tell you because it feels like there are 2 novellas within this novel. The things that bind these 2 parts together are the themes of feminism, womanhood, motherhood, bodily autonomy, abortion. She touches on a range of topics that are so pertinent and important to the female experience, and she does it with such precision and without any shame or guilt, which is why I really ended up enjoying it. The beauty of Breast and Eggs for me are those quiet conversations between characters. It was an illuminating read for me, and I really enjoyed the conversations that these characters had. I highly recommend if you're interested in any of the themes that I alluded to. The next book on this list is 7 Days in June by T.L. Williams. And the reason that I don't own this book is because I'm a newbie to the romance genre. It's a genre that I've very much left unexplored. It's one that I started to dip my toes into over the past 2 years, but it's a genre where I don't know all of the tropes and I don't know which tropes I enjoy, so it's one that I want to continue exploring. 7 Days in June is a romance book that I completely fell in love with. It is a second chance romance that centers older characters, and I really, really like that. Our main character, Eva, also is struggling with chronic illness. She has chronic migraines that affect her day-to-day life, and I thought that Tia Williams handled this topic in a very masterful way. So in this book, we're following Eva and Shane, who are both writers. Shane is more of a literary fiction writer, and Eva is a romance erotica writer. When they were younger, they spent a week together where they fell in love, but because of certain circumstances, they were pulled apart and they went on their own way. Now, years later, they're both adults with their own lives, they're successful authors within their own genres, and secretly, they've been writing messages to each other in the books that they write. Now, call it fate, serendipity, or whatever you want, but they are brought back together and they want to make it work. We have main characters who are both writers, and so we do have conversations about the publishing industry and about the sexism that happens in it. We also have conversations about the public perception of different genres, how literary fiction is seen as highbrow, whereas romance and erotica authors are not always lauded at the same level as authors in different genres. Eva also has a daughter, and I really love the interaction between Eva and her daughter and their relationship. It was just such a well done book that had so many layers to it. This is currently the romance book that I'm going to compare all of my other romance reads to because it was perfection, in my opinion. We are down to the top 3 books that I read in 2022. So earlier I alluded to this next book. I said that I used to be a big fan of historical fiction, and then I dropped off that wagon, and that there was a book that I fell in love with that made me fall back in love with the genre, and that is going to be Violeta by Isabel Allende. This is translated by Frances Riddle. This is actually the first book that I've read by Isabel Allende. I know, what a tragedy, but I will be reading her backlist after this. I actually ended up reading an arc through NetGalley of this book, and I loved it so much that I went out and purchased it. So Violeta is told in first-person narration, and we follow Violeta as she recounts 100 years of her life from the early 1920s to about the 2020s. And she does this through a series of letters for someone named Camilo. And we have no idea who Camilo is until the very end of the book. But yes, the story was just so captivating. We start off learning about Violeta as she's this bratty, spoiled child growing up in an unnamed Latin American country. She's eventually humbled by life circumstances and everything going on in the world. I also really loved the way that history was woven into the book. We already established that I love to learn about history, but what I found really refreshing in particular with Violeta is that we learn more about different events in history like the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression, but through a non-American lens. What else do I want to say about this book? I feel like I'm not expressing just how much I loved it. It's a tapestry. It's a beautiful tapestry of someone's life and how different people come in and out of your life and the impact that they leave behind. I think that's all I want to say. Yeah. So we made it to the top 2 books that I read in 2022, and in my mind, these are both interchangeable. On any given day, I would say that they switch places. Let's just call them my top 2 books of 2022. But I will start off by talking about Elena Knows by Claudia Pinero. This was also translated by Frances Riddle. First of all, it's a very short book. It's under 150 pages. And it's a book that I originally didn't quite like. And the reason for that is because our main character is a very flawed and unsavory character. It's difficult being in her head at times because she has this disgust for the world and for herself and for other people. But I think that's the reason that I kept thinking about this book over and over and over again after I read it. So at the surface, Elena Knows is a murder mystery. Her daughter Rita is dead and it was ruled a suicide. But Elena knows that there's no possible way that her daughter could have committed suicide. And so she is convinced that she was murdered. And so in this book, we take a journey with Elena. It's told in the span of one day. And we go on this journey with her. in which she's trying to get to a particular person that will help her find what truly happened to her daughter. Now, this is told in a very interesting and particular way. We follow Elena through 4 different cycles that are measured in pills that she needs to take for her late stage Parkinson's disease. Without these pills, she is not able to move or have control of her body, which is why she needs this person to help her find out what happened to her daughter. There are so many themes in this book that are explored, like motherhood, illness, aging, mother-daughter relationships, what we think we know, what we think is owed to us, the value of life, which lives we think are worth more than others, abortion. Like there's just so much to unpack in such a tiny novel and through the particular lens that it's told through. I think it's a great book club pick, but it's also one that is hard to read. And like I mentioned, the main character is really unsavory, so I think a lot of people will struggle to be in her head for this amount of time. But still, if any of that sounds good to you, oh my goodness, so good. So I took a quick little break. I had to go eat because I was starving, but I am back to talk about my favorite book that I read in 2022, and that goes to none other than Djinn Patrol on the Purple Line by Deepa Anappara. And like I mentioned, this is interchangeable with Elena Knows on Any Given Day. I loved both of these books, and it's interesting because both of them at the surface are about one thing, but they end up delving into deeper themes and topics, and I just really enjoyed the way that they're told and portrayed. So on the surface, Djinn Patrol on the Purple Line is a slow burn mystery novel about kids that keep going missing in India, and it is told from the perspective of 3 separate kids. We are following Jay, Buddy, and Faiz, who become sleuth detectives as they begin an investigation when one of their classmates goes missing. And from there, we go on an adventure with these kids into their troubles, into their lives, and first and foremost, into their hearts. It's such a heartfelt story that just took my breath away. You know, when you go into a book thinking it's one thing, and it ends up being what you expected, but even more, and it just takes your breath away. That's what Djinn Patrol on the Purple Line was for me. Just like Ashley Ford, Deepa Anappara is a spectacular storyteller. The way that she captured the voices of these kids and just infused the story with their witty humor and their humanity and their troubles and their adventures and their innocence was just masterfully done. So deeper than just a murder mystery. This is a book about children living in the slums of India and those children trying to survive among the negligence, the bigotry, and the inequality that is pervasive around them. There's also a lot of social commentary that is woven throughout the narrative of the book. Some of the things that Deepa Anappara touches on are the Hindu-Muslim conflict, class struggle, police corruption, and those deemed worth investigating. Such a beautiful novel to read. I loved it, and I hope that you pick it up because wow, it was fantastic. I know this video is super late, but I hope that you were able to find a book that seems interesting and hopefully a new favorite for you down the road. If you've made it this far, leave a star emoji down below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next one. Bye.